Hello, everybody, and thank you for choosing to join us today, making time in your otherwise webinar-packed week to come and listen to us talk about healthcare and cybersecurity. It's terrific to have seen so many people sign up for this. Sincerely, thank you for participating. We hope you're here because you are passionate about the subject like we are. The panel that we have today, myself included, all have deep roots in healthcare and cyber, and we strongly believe that we are just seeing the crest of a wave right now of challenges in this space when it comes to protecting health data, protecting healthcare organizations. Certainly an amplification of attacks recently that we're going to talk about, and do a bit of a retrospective on some of the breaches and attacks that we've seen in the past year, and kind of dissect some of those things and look for common issues. And come at this from a few different angles too, from the cybersecurity lens, from the healthcare practitioner or healthcare technology lens, and then also the business side of healthcare, looking at the needs and operational constraints of the healthcare space. So we'll do a quick round of introductions for everyone. I will start. So I am the real Iain Paterson. I am CEO of Cycura. About Cycura very briefly, we are a specialized cyber company that focuses on technical security assessment type work, a lot of pen testing and that kind of stuff. We work with a lot of healthcare companies. My background actually though is in healthcare as well as banking and government, but worked in a clinical setting for nearly 5 years and was director of security operations for a government agency that protects the health record of 13 million people. So very passionate about this space in particular, and my company is owned by a health tech company now, Well Health Technologies. So remain very close to those healthcare roots, and spent a lot of time looking into and doing research around ways that we can hopefully improve the resilience of healthcare companies. I will pass it over to fake Iain Paterson and let him introduce himself and his company and explain what they do.
Thank you, Iain. So my name is Iain L. Paterson, and that's what we're going to be going by today to keep things separate. CEO here at Plurilock Security. So we're a West Coast-based company. So we're West Coast, Best Coast, or Iain West, as we've been jokingly referring to me earlier today. So Plurilock is an AI-backed company that is able to identify people based on their behavior. So this is the core capability. Our clients include US government, Canadian government, banks, financial institutions. And ultimately, people buy our service because they're looking for a level of confidence and assuredness that it's the right user on the device at the right time. Why does that matter? Well, in today's COVID environment, especially with people working from home, very rarely are people actually in the office. And so you lose a lot of the physical controls to keep people safe. What we're finding is that organizations are turning to newer technologies like ours that help meet multi-factor authentication requirements to be able to ultimately understand and protect data. My relationship to healthcare is that probably the largest source of inquiries that we're getting right now and customers that we're talking to are around remote work and specifically how to keep data safe. And what's interesting is that it's agnostic. It's healthcare, it's finance, it's other industries as well. And so the lens that I'm trying to bring to the conversation today is really around what are the macro problems that are facing the healthcare industry, and how can we maybe take lessons learned from other industries, finance, government, et cetera, and apply those to healthcare to raise the bar for everybody.
Great, thanks, Iain. I will pick on Daniele next.
Pleased to meet you. Great to be here today to talk about healthcare cybersecurity. I've had a 20-year career in cybersecurity focusing on threat intelligence and digital forensics and incident response. I've helped a number of different healthcare institutions respond to cyber attacks within a clinical setting. And within the last year, I've been working with a new cybersecurity startup called Scope Security, running their threat intelligence practice. So we're actually particularly focused on building out detections for healthcare-related incidents and breaches, and looking at IOCs across the industry and how to respond to them within a healthcare setting. So that is my background, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Next, Mr. David Dowe.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. My name is Dave Dowe. I am the Director for Cybersecurity at ICES. ICES is a research institute in the province of Ontario with a special status under the provincial privacy law that allows us to collect the personal health information of Ontarians to provide analytical and research capabilities on that data. So much like other organizations, we've got a large set of personal health information here that we're responsible for protecting. And I come to ICES from other healthcare experience, over 15 years of working in healthcare, most recently at Trillium Health Partners Hospital Network. And I have also worked in the privacy side of healthcare as well, so I have a kind of a deep understanding of the challenges that healthcare is under and the challenges that we face in trying to put in place controls and processes to protect it all.
Terrific. Thank you, David. And last but definitely not least, Mr. Arjun Kumar.
Hi, everyone. There we go. So I am Arjun Kumar. My background has been predominantly healthcare, more on the front lines, definitely not as smart as the rest of the guys in the group, but hopefully I'm here to bring some sort of practical and level-headed questions to all the experts here about how to really make things practical. So my background is I spent about 10 years actually working on the front lines of healthcare. I did cardiac and vascular ultrasounds for almost 10 years, worked in clinical care that entire time. I then decided that it would be a smart idea to start an EMR vendor, and we became the largest open source CMR vendor in Canada, and we were subsequently acquired by Well Health Technologies, the same company that Cycura is now part of. I currently sit as the CIO of Well Health Technologies, and I also am running the entire EMR group, which is now the third largest platform for EMR across the country at the moment. So our goal is, rapidly expand, but at the same time, cybersecurity has become the main thing that keeps me up at night. I've been on the clinical side where, two-letter passwords were acceptable because it made healthcare work faster. But then I've also been on the side trying to convince doctors that two-character passwords are not good enough. So now, really what we need to bring into cybersecurity into the healthcare space, hopefully that, the message brought from these experts and, other experts in the industries, how we can make that a practical approach that our end users will actually adopt and use properly and not take shortcuts and cut corners. So hopefully I can bring a nice balance to the group of practicality when it comes to cybersecurity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Arjun. So it's great to have such a diverse panel here today. There is a Q&A box. Feel free to drop questions in as we kind of go through the topics. We want this to be as interactive as possible. The format is we're just going to talk about some of the events that we have observed over the last year that have made the news, and then hopefully share some insights and thoughts as to how these events have occurred, and what some of the good protections that organizations might be able to implement to protect themselves from these types of events, or some of the areas that people need to focus their attention and efforts and energy on if they're implementing a security program to try and protect from some of these types of attacks, because there is a lot of common themes in them. So I'm going to kick it off with one that's actually very recent in the news. It's interesting because of the size and scope of it, and also because the threat actor is just so predominant in security headlines right now. So the University of Vermont medical system in the United States is a 6-hospital, 1,000 doctor, 2,000 nurse type health network based in Vermont. They provide a wide range of care, everything from long-term care to chemotherapy, cancer care, acute care, those types of services at these different 6 different hospitals that fall in this network. They have been essentially crippled for the last 2 to 3 weeks now since a cyber attack where ransomware was deployed in that network. The group that perpetrated this attack goes by the handle of Ryuk, R-Y-U-K. If you do some searching around that, you will find that this group is very active, and there are estimates that this group in the last year has extracted over $150 million in ransom from various organizations around the world. They are opportunistic. They will target healthcare companies. They don't care if you're a hospital. They will go after large enterprises as well, though. So they're not being particularly specific in who they're going after here. They really will focus, though, on who can afford to pay. And they will extract large ransoms from people. In the case of UVM, it doesn't look like or sound like they have chosen to pay this ransom. There's a lot of discussion and debate in our field whether or not it is the ethical thing to do to pay that ransom. That is a hotly contested topic depending on who you talk to, and there has been guidance on both sides from law enforcement, depending on what country you're in, actually. In the case of UVM, they've had to call in the National Guard and the FBI to try and assist them in trying to contain and isolate the spread of this ransomware inside the network and make sure that they won't accidentally reinfect themselves if they bring things back online. Obviously, across 6 sites with thousands of computers, that's going to be a very cumbersome effort. One of the things that this stands out to me here about this type of incident is that healthcare organizations, even something as big as 6 hospital health system, they're not really prepared or trained or equipped in terms of tooling to respond to these types of incidents. So the tools that would need to be in place for somebody to quickly triage, contain, and isolate the infected workstations are probably not readily available in these types of organizations. They're usually tools that would require a dedicated team to operate and to manage those tools and make sure that they stay current. And so that is one of the bigger challenges that I've observed in healthcare. I ran a security team in the hospital that then David inherited later on. And, the challenge always is there's a lot going on and not necessarily enough bodies. Even if you get the funding to buy, specialized tools, having a small team available to run them doesn't necessarily give you the capability to respond effectively if something like this crops up. So that's a current event that's going on and still being cleaned up in the news. So that's the one I wanted to bring up, in that's my observation and my own experience working in this space. I'll open it up to David next, actually, to talk about one of the ones that he wanted to share with the group.
Yeah, thanks, Iain. And for sure, there's some commonalities in the attack I'm going to talk about. And it's you might be familiar with it. It's the ransomware event that took place in Germany, where the media really picked it up pretty widely because it was the first reported case of a patient dying as a result of ransomware. And so what I'll do is I'll just kind of go over the background and then kind of highlight some kind of interesting facts about this unfortunate case. And so the Dusseldorf University Hospital, like many hospitals, they got hit with ransomware, and they had a bunch of systems down as a result. And what's interesting here is that they actually closed and they canceled their actually emergency care center as a result. So in this specific case, a patient was en route to Dusseldorf University Hospital, and while in an ambulance after having a stroke, was redirected to another hospital 30 kilometers away. And what happened then is that, you know, at the hospital, we later found out that there was about 30 servers that were infected with ransomware, with a note obviously to contact the hackers. And so what they did was like I mentioned, they canceled emergency care, and they canceled planned outpatient visits as well. And even their email systems went down. And so what's interesting in this case is, you know, the police were involved and actually took the main point of contact on behalf of the hospital with the attackers. And they were involved quite early. And when they actually talked to the attackers, they explained that the attack hit a hospital that was treating emergency patients. And although, you know, you might not expect much to happen with that, that's usually the goal to get leverage, since these hospitals require immediate access to the data they have, which makes them a prime target, since they'll be more willing to pay. What ended up happening was the attackers, if, you know, these reports are to be believed, reportedly, you know, withdrew their extortion demands and the ransom demands, and actually provided the decryption key to unlock the files and the servers that were encrypted. And what's, I think, pretty interesting here is that if that's the case, it's pretty obvious that the attackers either, you know, had a very specific target in mind, and once the police informed them that this Dusseldorf University Hospital was treating patients, they seemed to recognize that this was not their intended target, and they backed off and gave the decryption keys. And in this specific case, the vulnerability that was exploited was the well-known Citrix VPN vulnerability that was announced back in late 2019. But what's interesting is the hospital reports having applied that in early January when Citrix made that patch available. So there's some speculation that there may have been some persistence in the network from potentially 9 months when this attack took place in September. And then as well, I think what I really want to highlight is that there's two kind of really noteworthy takeaways from this. Is that, you know, the attackers, which you don't often hear about, gave the decryption keys over without any payment, and this could be spin. We don't know for sure. That they could be trying to hide their ransom payment, but in this case, because there are so many local and state German authorities involved that have been providing details and evidence, because there are prosecutions that are pending. There's some kind of a negligent homicide charge that's pending. You could argue that there's the reliability of the evidence is pretty strong, given that the authorities are sharing this. But I think what it shows is that if that's the case, that these attackers are oftentimes very targeted in who they're attempting to target. So if it's the wrong hospital, there was cases in local reports that they were attempting to target another local university rather than a university affiliated hospital. So that's one thing. So there may be something that value that they were going over specifically. And then the other case is kind of what Iain was talking about in the last one, is how organizations respond to these cases and how they're oftentimes not prepared technically. But in this case, and I would, you know, put the question out there to other healthcare organizations, you know, your incident response playbook. At what point do you engage law enforcement, and how early in the process do you do that? And when you do, what role do they play? What, you know, do you want to invite them into your incident response program, or you try and manage this as best you can without their involvement and really only involved when you need to? Oftentimes just to give them a heads up that it happened so they can document that this happened and for their stats, or are they going to take a more proactive approach like you see here happening in Germany? And so I think, you know, in addition to making sure that you've got the right staffing and resources and the tools in place, you know, it might bear revisiting your incident response playbooks to see at what point do you want to bring in the police and work with your internal stakeholders to figure out what that would look like. You know, in the absence of an event or an incident, that might be a helpful discussion to have proactively. And then, of course, since this is the first case where someone's reported to have died as a result of ransomware, I think the context is helpful to remind ourselves that, you know, we don't know for sure if that patient would have survived, even if they were delivered to the hospital without being redirected. You know, ambulances are oftentimes redirected, especially in Ontario. You know, critical care beds fill up, and there's a whole information system that is in place to help direct ambulances to hospitals where there are available beds and resources. So the redirection of an ambulance, isn't all that uncommon. But obviously, in this case, where they're trying to find some more information, any delay for a stroke or any other critical incident would be unfortunate. So that's probably where this is kind of coming down. But I think some unfortunate outcomes for sure, and we're going to learn more as time goes on, and as law enforcement is involved in this case, hopefully we'll get a better understanding of what took place in the end.
Great, thank you, Dave. I want to open up the law enforcement questions of the group because it's really interesting. Actually, I'd like to get perspectives. One thing I will say too about the UVM one that I brought up is that they have had to delay critical care. For example, the chemotherapy department, they have had to go from 40 treatments per day down to 15 because they can't schedule accurately. Because they don't have the tooling. So, is it immediately killing somebody? Perhaps not. Long term, probably, right? Because you can't deliver that care right now because you don't have the tools. So the law enforcement question is fascinating, and it has a lot of jurisdictional nuance, and it has a lot of I guess, there's a lot of politicization of that amongst organizations. So I would love to open it to the other panelists and get your take, guys, on what you think about involving law enforcement in a data breach or in an incident response situation, and what organizations should be doing there.
I guess I'll go ahead and throw in on this question, having tackled incident response scenarios so many times at different points in my career. I think, especially as it pertains to ransomware payments, coordination with law enforcement is something that I always encourage with clients. Certainly in the private sector, there's always concerns about corporate information being shared with the police that may ultimately leak outwards, and there's a reticence on behalf of corporations to cooperate with police on these sorts of investigations, particularly early on. But at the same time, law enforcement agencies have built specialized units to tackle the problem of REUC in particular. That is a crimeware kit that has been implicated in a number of different critical breaches, has caused massive amounts of damage. It's been used to break into critical infrastructure, even outside of healthcare. So there are, even in Canada, specialized units within policing that are tackling problems related to REUC. I would encourage cooperation early on, and especially at the point in time where you are making a ransomware payment. The United States most recently had put out a bulletin suggesting that any corporation that's making a ransomware payment to an address that is associated with a listed entity may actually face charges themselves in supporting foreign agents, or supporting terrorism, or supporting whatever it is that listed organization has been involved in. So that has really raised the stakes. At the same time, it also has kind of the hint of punishing the victim a little bit as well, because some of these organizations, especially in healthcare, there are really good reasons why it's incredibly difficult to get back up and running. And I understand why some hospitals would want to look at making those ransomware payments. And then, of course, if you have a government that is suggesting that if you go ahead and do that for the protection and safety of your patients, to get back up and running and operational as quickly as possible, that they will come after you, it's caused a lot of complexity that we haven't had to deal with before with respect to ransomware breaches and how organizations and companies handle them. I think that this is also going to put a wrench in the business of so-called middlemen or ransomware brokers that negotiate payments on behalf of corporations. I don't know how that's going to affect the ransomware broker business, but I would suspect it's probably not going to last very long, because most of those organizations don't have the means to ensure that they are not paying money to a listed entity. So anyway, some thoughts from my end on ransomware payments and cooperation with law enforcement.
You know what I find really interesting is that if you take like a private physician's practice or sort of a small scale healthcare organization, if somebody broke into the clinic and stole a server, the first call would be to law enforcement. If somebody electronically breaks in, it doesn't even cross their mind that a call to law enforcement is needed. So, I think there's also a lack of education of, the proper steps of what is actually required and how you should respond to a virtual, theft as you would respond to a physical theft. So I think that the channels for them to approach it, if you don't have a large scale cybersecurity firm you're working with, or if you don't have access to a department that can help handle this stuff, a lot of the general public is sort of left with the question of what is the appropriate step to take next.
For sure. On the digital side of it, I will say that one of the areas that creates complexity in hospital networks and systems is the inability to monitor access appropriately, the inability to control privileged accounts and things like that. That is causing a lot of complexity that allows these attacks to occur. So other Iain, if you want to give your opinion on how do we address some of these identity problems that are creating this, or I guess not creating, but certainly making the situation worse.
Well, I think it's hard. So I'll speak a little bit about just identity in general, and then the example that I was actually going to give has to do with a healthcare clinic physically losing a laptop. So it's very topical to what Arjun and John were just speaking about. I mean, at the end of the day, most regulation and best practice really comes down to, is the right person accessing the right data or system at the right time? And that's, for all the buzzwords and for all the vendors that are out there trying to push products, ultimately it really comes down to, is it the right person doing the right thing at the right time? I think that the challenge historically has been that the mechanisms to prove that are frustrating. So Arjun talked about, a 3-letter password might have been too long. You kind of want to get it down to a 2-letter password, because ultimately the job that the healthcare professional is trying to do is they're trying to treat their patient. They're not trying to log into a system. They're just trying to treat their patient. And any friction that gets added to that process is inhibiting their ability to get their job done. So as a result, I think that it's really, really important for cybersecurity vendors in particular to think about usability and to think about convenience as a factor when designing systems. So for us, as an example, part of our mission statement ultimately is to be able to prove you're the right person just by how you type on a keyboard. We're not interested in what your password is. We're not interested in anything else. We just want to look at the behavior that you exhibit. And then we have AI that allows us to identify if it's the right person in the background. It doesn't require an extra step. I think that's the crucial point. And so are there other technologies, are there other systems that healthcare workers in particular can put in place to get their job done that doesn't require those extra steps? That's ultimately the root of the question that I've been asking folks in the industry, because I think that these technologies are coming online. I think that there are abilities now, whereas maybe 10 years ago there wasn't, to be able to answer some of those questions. And so how can we deploy those capabilities inside of healthcare organizations to ultimately get their job done of improving patient care?
Some of the single sign-on that existed kind of 10 years ago in healthcare was just not good. Like stuff that would just cut and paste passwords from stores into fields, like it wasn't true integration, right? And the security implications of some of that. I recall a doctor pointing out that if you just drop Notepad in front of something right before it pastes, then you'll get the password in plain text. Like that kind of stuff. So seeing better solutions in healthcare to solve some of the challenges that they have around how security is enabled and the way that healthcare applications need to work together. That needs to happen faster, and more of that needs to happen in that space, because it really has only been affordable at, say, the hospital level. And even then, here in Canada, I've found that we're well outspent by our US counterparts in that regard. I want to ask John for some of his perspectives on some of the healthcare specific stuff that he's seeing. So Scope have this really kind of unique view of the world. Like for the last 10 years, there's been a bit of a boogeyman of you know, people are attacking healthcare organizations, you know, they're really targeting them. And when I was, you know, acting as security officer for a healthcare organization, we were getting attacked, absolutely, but was it healthcare specific? Not necessarily. And now I feel like that's changed perhaps. And I'd certainly like John to maybe share some perspectives as to what they see with the visibility that they have.
So I think the dynamic has really shifted. I mean, 2020 has put ransomware attacks and external threat actors front and center for the healthcare organizations. It's also, and leading up to 2020, it's also the first time that we've seen nation states develop threat groups to go after healthcare. So this is something that's pretty new. We haven't typically had to worry about Iran targeting hospitals and trying to break in and gather information, exfiltrate information, or you know, install ransomware and things like that. It's a really unique threat, and that's really been front and center in the last couple of years in terms of where the trend was. Prior to that, however, a lot of the kinds of breaches that I had been looking into within healthcare were much more related to privacy breaches. So there were individuals within the healthcare setting that were being paid off by external threat actors in order to run queries against the system. And it's not always queries against notable people and personalities. Sometimes it does have to do with that, but sometimes it's just simply whoever the target of that external threat actor is, gaining access to their healthcare records and file gives them some leverage in some way to understand how to get at the target. And you know, there were incidents even here in Canada where it was, you know, quite clear that individuals had been paid to share this information with external threat actors. And that's something that is little known. Most organizations don't have extensive privacy breach technologies and reporting, so they don't dive into those kinds of incidents. I would say the majority of hospitals don't even know when this is happening, are completely unaware, because unless you are looking for privacy breaches, you may not necessarily see them. And you also will never find them by just doing a random audit. There are so many different clients that I have that just run random audits that have never actually found a privacy breach in the 12 to 24 months. But as soon as a forensic incident happens, you know, maybe there was a cyber breach that occurred, and we're starting to look at, did those threat actors get to hospital records? Did they get to the EMR? Did they get into the clinical environment at all? When we start to try to answer those questions, we find out that, oh, absolutely, like these threat actors are, you know, laterally moving. They may leverage access on one machine, you know, perhaps you know, a piece of ransomware or malware had just been installed on a clinical workstation, but they're trying to pivot and maneuver to get access to the information that they want. You know, especially in the U.S., healthcare being principally privately run, you've got lots of credit card information to go after. You also have personal identification, like PII, not even personal health information. You've got personally identifiable information that has a market value in underground markets. And these are the kinds of things that threat actors are going after. And these are the ways that they're doing it. You know, they are leveraging intern employees. They're paying people off. They are breaking into systems. They are moving laterally from whatever hook they get into your environment. They're doing phishing attacks. You know, these are the kinds of things that are now happening more and more frequently within healthcare.
I think as well too, what we've seen a big uptick in is attacks against organizations that are housing research on COVID data. You know, aware of attacks going after specific individual researchers, or be it lab technicians who have access into areas that store data about this, so it's not always the head researcher or something like that. It's somebody with just enough access to get into that data. And that data is valuable for the purposes of research around vaccines, for the research around community spread and things like that. And we have seen some very specific targeted attacks recently. They're not necessarily on the news, but they do exist. We're aware of them. So,
one in particular that I'd like to highlight, I know we're talking about COVID because it's timely, but cancer research.
yeah.
You know, that I have found amongst nation state threat actors is a particular target. There's so many different reasons why cancer research is important and also of monetary value to other nation states. And I find that is a specific target within the healthcare community. Little known issue, not a lot of visibility. You don't hear about it talked about in the press or what have you. But I would suggest that's one area. Research institutions that are involved in cancer research, development of therapies and drugs ought to build more sophisticated visibility and detection mechanisms, because they ostensibly are targets of other nation states that want access to that information, want access to those therapies.
All right. Arjun and Dave, you both sit on top of mountains of patient data and research data, respectively. What is the view of the practitioner, of the custodian of data then, when it comes to these challenges, and what are some thoughts on ways that organizations need to protect themselves, or what are some of the ways that healthcare needs to pivot to be more ready to deal with these threats, if you have insights that way? Otherwise, what are the things that scare you about it?
Yeah, from my perspective, one of the biggest fears I have is the blatant risk that we have across the entire sector of social engineering still being able to happen. It's one of those things that there's not enough sort of on the ground, frontline training going on to make sure that people are being smart, people are being protective of their data. From the healthcare custodian standpoint, when they hire a company like ours, like an EMR vendor, we're expected that we're managing everything and handling everything. And we're handling everything we can within our scope. But, you leave a computer unlocked in your clinic, we can't actually help with that. That's beyond where, our reach goes. So I think from my perspective that there is a lot of work to be done. The question is how to accurately and efficiently deploy it and get it in practice is a major step. But in the meantime, all we can do as a vendor, as a corporation, is invest in experts like the group on this panel and many of our attendees today. That you guys are the ones that are helping us reset the bar, helping us actually, as you said, sleep at night. That those are the big things that sort of keep me up. But I think that there is a two-pronged approach that has to be taken. And as we may be just an agent to the healthcare custodian, we still, I think, have a higher responsibility than the healthcare custodian themselves, because it's not their core competency. Their healthcare custodian, their core competency is really going to be the patient care. So we just have to make sure that we go above and beyond in these situations.
Fantastic. Thank you for that answer. Just before we pass to Dave, I just will remind people that we do have the Q&A open. So if anybody wants to chuck any questions in for us to bring up in the discussion, feel free. There's a lot of knowledge here, and we've all seen some stuff. So we'd certainly like to answer any questions people have or speak about specific topics. Dave, so your organization, houses patient record data and lab data and all sorts of information for 13 million residents of Ontario. Your job is to protect that. What are the approaches that you think are important? What are the things that you're trying to do, that you're trying to achieve with your program? And where are the areas that you think it's going to be hard?
Yeah, and I think what I will say is that the media attention that these attacks generate are quite advantageous in helping advance the importance of information security practices within the organization. so that when we go ahead and make requests for certain resourcing or tools, the the executive team is already very keenly aware of the threat landscape, and paying attention to the news. It makes our job a lot easier to go ahead and make those requests, because it's quite obvious. They don't have to hear it from me, right? They're hearing from everyone else that that the threats are there. And uniquely as a research institute, I know John talks about oftentimes the challenges that hospitals face, the complexity of the environment, the challenges and the interconnectedness of all the different systems, and the challenges of running a 24/7 operation where you aren't afforded with downtimes to patch systems or to do updates or re-architect how things are run. And a lot of times you're kind of trying to patch things together in a way that reduces risk, and it's often quite challenging to do that. And I don't think there's enough awareness within out there about just how challenging it is to mature a cybersecurity program in a hospital, because it's not easy and it takes sustained grunt work to get it done. And I think that's why we see hospitals that are in the crosshairs, and I think that's why we see hospitals in the news, right? Because it's not easy. If it was easy, it would be done by now. And I think that we're not close yet either, unfortunately, to having to turn the corner. But I think for other healthcare organizations or research institutes that have targets, it's incumbent on us now to get really creative, right? So, we got to reimagine and make things as difficult as you can for threat actors. Do you really need open internet access on every workstation? Probably not. Just the ubiquity of cell phones, the clinical staff can access the personal internet resources on their cell phones now. Maybe organizations really need to start locking down the types of internet resources that they can access throughout the organization. And likewise with email, do you really need to have it available so that you can receive an email address from anybody in the internet? Or do you want to put in a block list? And then you could actually add an allow list for users to send emails to staff in your organization. So I think, we've got to really be creative and try and solve some of these problems in ways that we haven't had to before. And I think it's through that type of creative thinking where, you aren't always just relying on more money, but maybe being pretty aggressive with some of the tools and configurations you have to try and make things difficult. I know, Arjun, some of your users might not be wild about trying to make things a bit more difficult, but I think, just taking a look around the horizon, just seeing what's happening. I think the users that we're responsible for providing information systems to, it's our job to make them aware of what's happening, so that when they do see some of these more strict controls come through that are creative, but sometimes can create some impedance to the work that they're doing, they can understand and buy into what we're trying and do.
I think just to expand a little bit on what you said in terms of the problem of complexity of cybersecurity in healthcare, I think that is the one issue that the healthcare industry is having, because they're often recruiting people from other cybersecurity fields into healthcare, and many cybersecurity professionals, I think, underestimate the kinds of complexity that they're going to encounter. I mean, if you think about a hospital, you've got a clinical data environment, you've got a traditional IT environment, then you've got your health record systems and what have you. And hospitals form hospital networks, and they're tightly interwoven. So a lot of these systems have to share all of this information with each other. And so at the end of the day, you can't compartmentalize a hospital setting as you would any other corporation. So security professionals often will descend onto healthcare. They might get hired as a CISO, and the first thing that they try to do is, all right, let's get some segmentation going here. Let's stop communication from this clinical workstations. Why do the clinical workstations have to talk to these IT systems there? Well, they do. And you can't just go around and isolate things at will. And trying to figure out a segmentation strategy that works, because certainly there's some areas where you probably should have segmentation, but how to do that is going to look very different than your traditional organization. And I think we're going through a lot of growing pains, because as cybersecurity professionals come into this industry, they have to reorient their thinking. Just medical IoT alone and authentication is a huge concern, because you've got FDA rules in the US that say, there can't be any impediment between the doctor and the use of this device within a surgical setting. So if the doctor has to type in a password and he forgets his password, or for some reason that authentication control goes down, that's a serious reportable issue. So at the end of the day, how do you tackle authentication in a manner that is not going to present patient safety issues on the surgical floor. And that's the reason why you see things like, you know, medical IoT having weak or no passwords, or shared account usage across a clinical setting. And these are challenges that are unique to healthcare, and they're not easily solved. As much as I'd love to slap a password on every single system, honestly, there are reasons why that's the case, and unless there's a change in law, that's not going to change anytime soon. So, so those are some of the challenges that I've noticed working in healthcare over the last few years or so that I don't think that our colleagues in cybersecurity appreciate.
I think maybe just building on what John articulated. I mean, I think that there are definitely some differences in healthcare. There's also a couple of similarities to other what I call niche industries. So, as an example, if you're trying to secure a power plant, you know, one of the things that you absolutely can't do is you absolutely cannot disallow access to the power plant operator from being able to control sensitive systems. And so, when you're thinking about you know, isolation and containment, you know, that's not in the toolbox for that particular user. And so, from an identity access control, thinking through, okay, well, what are the ramifications if we detect something anomalous? If we think that the user is not the user, what do we do? Well, it's not lock them out of their workstation, because we can't. Well, what are the things that we can do? What are the triggers that we can do? I think the other thing that I would say is that as organizations are progressing along their digital transformation and going from a traditional on-premise, running on bare metal hardware, storing data locally, and then moving to the cloud, part of that transformation does present some opportunities to, if not minimize risk, at least move risk over to other locations. So, as an example, the security breach that I was going to mention was a healthcare organization in Oregon. It was the Health Share of Oregon, which is the largest Medicaid coordinated care organization, that had to notify 650,000 patients that their personal data may have been exposed. What was interesting, though, is that the attack vector here was not ransomware, and I had to hunt to find a breach that was not ransomware related, because healthcare is pretty rife with it right now. But the attack vector was interesting for two reasons. One was the laptop that had the data was stolen, so this was a fairly low-tech approach. The second is that the laptop itself did not belong to the Health Share of Oregon, it belonged to one of their vendors. And so when you're thinking through the risk that comes with storing personal identifiable information, PII, or personal health information, PHI, it's not even just about what you're doing as an organization, it's about what is your ecosystem doing. Because it may be your patient that has data on somebody else's server, and ultimately that is going to affect you. So the takeaway here from the Health Share breach, number one, was it was really a vendor risk consideration. Like who were the vendors that they were working with? Did they have appropriate security controls? It's entirely possible that Health Share of Oregon is the leader of cybersecurity in the region. I mean, we from the public reporting, it's not entirely clear, but unfortunately, it was one of their vendors that was caught. The second insight here about this particular breach is that it wasn't even clear the data itself was accessed. So the laptop was stolen. On that laptop contained person identifiable information for hundreds of thousands of patients, but there was no clear, at least in the public sources that we have available, there was no clear identification on whether the data was even discovered by the attacker, whether the data was accessed, whether the data was encrypted, whether that encryption held up. And so there's all these unknowns, but even though they're unknowns and they're not confirmed to be bad, there was still a requirement to notify the patients that they may have been breached. There was also some monetary compensation offered. And so it was a large issue, even though there was no confirmed badness that took place. I just wonder, had an organization like that, had they been further along the digital transformation, had they been operating a cloud EMR system, had they been working with thin clients or something similar, would they still have had to roll the incident response, as we say in the industry, for a laptop theft like this, if the data was at least confirmed to not be on the device? And I don't know if Iain could chime in on that maybe.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, both myself and David have lived this nightmare. The reality is, if you do put proper controls in place, then it just becomes a financial loss, and there is no requirement for reporting, because we have certainty that that device was a managed device, that we are certain does have encryption, and that data is irretrievable, because the key can't be restored from the local device, as well as adding MDM and fleet control, to devices. Now, in the case of, though, what you're describing here, third-party vendors having your data on their laptop, that's where you get into a lot of the complexities that John highlighted too, which is data sharing amongst organizations, the integration of third-party systems and vendors who support those systems into your healthcare system or into your health technology environment. And then you also get into outsourcing of certain functions within organizations. In the hospital setting, some of the records management processes may be outsourced. People go in and review for billing purposes and then do all the billing coding. That gets outsourced in a lot of organizations. So we're circling around a whole bunch of the underlying problems that are kind of unique to healthcare, or semi-unique to healthcare, which is the control of data, sensitive data, and understanding those data flows and the custodianship of those data and the protection of that data at all the different points in its life cycle. And there's not a great answer to that particular problem, but being aware of where the data ends up, who owns it, how they're managing it, that's a huge part of it. If it's living on your own workstations, your own laptops, or your own mobile devices, then you should have controls that you can fall back on to protect it. If you're giving that data to somebody else, then you should be dictating to them the minimum levels of compliance that they should have before you will allow them to work on that data. Dave, I'll open it up to you, to probably chime in. I'm sure you probably have a similar take on it. But.
Well, when we're talking about third parties and the different vendors that we're working with in healthcare organizations, and to echo John's point earlier, the number of vendors and the number of different connected systems that you have with third parties grow every day, right? Like every year, at the end of the year, healthcare organizations can have a huge increase in the number of partners that they're working with. And so I think one of the themes from this talk is you're hearing quite loudly and clearly that it's hard in healthcare to do this, right? And so it's going to take sustained time. And the platitudes of, just patch, just segregate your network, although it's easy to say, it's really, so the basics are so difficult to do. And I think, just inventory your systems. Okay. Right. So I think, it's kind of a nice, refreshing take to know that it's not easy. And I think that's why we're seeing such continued hits in healthcare, because there is so much complexity. Third party, involvement and interconnectedness grows. The complexity of the environment continues to evolve and grow. It doesn't get simpler. And I think just being able to continue managing those risks are going to be an ongoing task that we're going to have to try and get better at all the time.
I think
Go ahead, John.
Iain had one thing I was going to mention is Iain number 1 or number 2, I can't tell now. Iain had mentioned EMR and EHR systems, and perhaps if they were ingesting some of that information, that they might have figured out whether there was a breach or not. That alone is also kind of an interesting problem, and that's the problem that I'm spending a lot of time right now trying to solve, which is this. Even if the security provider has those logs, what are they going to do with them? How do you detect anomalous behavior against an EMR EHR system when you have multiple logins and log-offs, and that's frequent throughout the day? You really have to use, machine learning algorithms to try to model that for a given environment, and then look at deviations from those typical patterns, and then apply some sort of risk assessment on that to suggest, okay, is this anomaly that you've detected against EHR representative of a security threat or not? And that's a really, really, really tough problem. And there's not enough vendors in the industry that are actually trying to tackle that. We're trying to tackle that with Scope, but it's an interesting challenge. I think we need more eyes on that particular area. What do we do, and how do we detect breaches against the EHR and EMR data? And then aside from that, how do you then put that into context with all the other telemetry that you have from across the environment, and can you tie the pieces together to suggest, this is what happened first, this was the next stage, and this is how the pivot happened into the EMR EHR. We're not anywhere close to that yet in the industry, and that's a big complexity that I think the industry is going to have to close in the years ahead.
So we did have one question, and it's a great question to kind of wind up the hour as we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to put this out to the group and get some different opinions and perspectives on this, which is, what is one of the easiest things a healthcare organization could do immediately to step up their cybersecurity practices, even if resources are tight, which they generally are in healthcare? So I'm going to open it up to the floor so I have time to think of a good answer, and let everyone give their take on that. What can we do that's kind of quick and effective to improve our security posture in healthcare?
So I'll kick it off. I mean, I think it's actually the same theme that John was hitting on, that David was hitting on, which is really around visibility. I think that you need to, first of all, take an inventory of what assets you have, both physical IT assets, like how many things are we trying to secure, but also data assets. I go back to the Oregon Health example. That ultimately the inventory that would have been nice to have was to say, where is our data being stored? And is it just in an EMR system somewhere? In which case, John brings up a good point. Then you can monitor entry and egress from that point, and then you've got a pretty good set of visibility that you can then look at. Doing something with that data is another problem, but at least you have the visibility. Or is data spread out? Is it on different systems? Who do we partner with? Who do we work with? Where is that data right now? And then from there, you can actually come up with a plan. I think it's very difficult to try and come up with a set of recommendations unless you know exactly what you're dealing with. And so the absence of having visibility, I think that's your indicator. The number one thing is just, where are you at right now?
I agree.
And if I were to offer one thing you could do, whether it's ransomware, whatever threats are out there, I think, patching and your systems is probably the best thing you can do. Work with your IT group who manages your desktops and your servers, and make sure that you're able to apply as many patches as you can, not just operating system, but application patches. Get an inventory of what you're using, and just patch like your life depends on it.
One important aspect, I think, that dovetails onto the asset management that both Dave and Iain had spoken about is, once you actually have gone through and you've got a list of assets, spend the time to understand what the criticality of each asset is and understand what the dependencies are with those systems. Because the biggest issue that I have as a breach responder is going into an environment, number one, having an asset list, whether that's available or not, and I might have to gather that on the fly if it's not available. But once you do have that asset list, understanding what the dependencies are between these assets is really important, because that's going to help me understand what is the most appropriate course of action for this breach or for this security incident. If I don't understand that I can't just isolate this device because it's connected to 3 other things that are critical, and maybe there's a sensor on a patient that cannot go down right now. If I don't understand that, then that's when missteps happen during the breach response process. And then of course you're just looking at more money and more time spent on recovery. So that's one thing that I would put there. And then also, formulating a plan for different kinds of likely scenarios for your organization, and then trying to do at least a tabletop exercise to think through with all the different pieces and all the different players related to that problem, think through it and kind of red team it in a tabletop way to say, okay, we've got a breach, this system goes down, here's where it came from, what do we do? Who do we call in? How do we report this? Do we bring in the executives? You know, does HR have to be involved? Do we have to make a public pronouncement about what this happened? Those are all complex things that you don't want to be thinking about at the time of the breach. So periodically revisiting that and having the exercise and developing some muscle memory around how to respond, who to call, what are the steps to go through, I find is something that can help you be more resilient when the inevitable happens.
Arjun, we have just enough time for you, my friend. You're closing it down.
I was going to say that one of the biggest things that, funds are limited. Knowing exactly where your points of risk are, I think, is one of the most important things that a lot of people overlook. People jump in feet first and say, okay, I need to solve all these problems and start spending money on, X, Y, and Z without understanding the full scope of their risks. So, going through a proper threat risk assessment, going through the proper exercises so you can at least understand how critical your risks are prior to then sort of doing the deep dive of big spending on trying to resolve your problems. It's always the best approach to really have an idea of what you're facing and if it needs to be a drop everything and tackle, or is it something that you can chip away at over time. So working with groups like Cycura has been phenomenal for us to poke these holes in things that we may not have thought of, just so we have it on a to-do list sooner than later.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just round up everything everybody said there. Security is a journey, and you walk it one step at a time and one day at a time. All of these things are thematic. All of these things are interrelated. Know how to detect yourself or detect things, know how to protect yourself from things, and be resilient and be able to recover. Those are the things that I would advise people. Think about it in those buckets. Spend your money accordingly, spend your time accordingly, and build a roadmap to continue towards continuous improvement. So everybody, that's an hour and 2 minutes. It's been phenomenal to have so many of you hang out with us today. Thank you so much for attending. This was great. Thank you to the panel. It's always great to have this group together and to do something like this. If we get good feedback, maybe we can do another one. But thank you everyone today. If you have any questions, reach out to any of us individually. And we will make recordings of this available online, I believe. And we hope to talk to you all again soon. Be safe. Good luck with the rest of 2020. It's been an exciting year. It will continue to be exciting. And we hope to talk to you all soon. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.